Welcome to Books at Berklee, a series of the library at the Berklee College of Music. I'm your host, Judy Pinnolis. Today, we welcome Dr. James Bradford, Associate Professor of History at Berklee. Along with being author of Poppies, Politics and Power, Afghanistan and the Global History of Drugs and Diplomacy, James Bradford has written numerous articles and chapters, most notably for Iranian Studies, or the Oxford Handbook of Global Drug History, in Global Histories for Illegal Cannabis Cultivation in the World, as well as The War on Drugs, 50 Years, $1 trillion, and 30 million arrests. Dr. Bradford has appeared on NPR, English Al Jazeera, and numerous other podcasts, and given lectures at the Yale Program in Iranian Studies and many workshops. He teaches classes on the history of politics of drugs, crime, and human rights at Berklee. We're going to speak with Dr. Bradford today about his book, Poppies, Politics and Power, Afghanistan and the Global History of Drugs and Diplomacy. Welcome, Dr. Bradford, to Books at Berklee.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited today to hear more about this topic. First of all, can you state briefly how you got interested in this topic and tell our viewers about how it evolved?
So I always had an interest in drugs and drug policy. I had taken a really interesting class as an undergrad on Latin America, and we obviously focused a good part of the class on sort of cocaine politics and economics, and it sort of piqued my interest, and it was something that sort of stuck with me. And when I finally decided to go to graduate school, was also during a period when there was starting to emerge more history of drugs. So the historiography of the field was growing, and I was sort of digging into things about the opium trade and cocaine trade, and even sort of more contemporary stuff regarding methamphetamine and amphetamine-based drugs. And it was really something where I just always had an interest in it. And so that was sort of the direction for me. Why Afghanistan was largely, there's been a huge focus on Latin America and Southeast Asia. And when we started to go through sort of exploring the literature, it was pretty obvious that there was not a lot of historical inquiry into South Asia, but particularly Afghanistan. And so this was, during a period right after 9/11, and the United States had invaded Afghanistan, and you had, hundreds of thousands of American troops and hundreds of thousands of, Westerners and various governments that were in the country. And Afghanistan is still a huge producer of opium. Arguably 80-90% of the world's heroin comes from this country, and that was the same, 20 years ago. So it was one of those things where my historical curiosity combined with sort of the contemporary events, and it just sort of seemed like a perfect union. That kind of took me in that direction.
That's certainly a large part of the culture. A number of important writers have stated about your book that it filled an empty spot in the archival research in the literature about Afghanistan. And I understand you did a tremendous amount of original research. As a librarian, of course, I was interested in that. It piqued my interest. Can you tell us a little bit about this sort of original research and what it takes and what sort of resources you looked at?
Yeah. So I'll sort of step back a little bit and sort of talk about Afghanistan as it was a field that was kind of dominated by anthropologists, and a lot of this is because Afghanistan historically was not a place that kept wonderful archival records. And so history, of course, is largely through the archives. It's through written documents. And some of this is a legacy of colonialism. Sort of, the colonial empires tended to keep like immaculate records. It's, the creation of these huge bureaucracies. And Afghanistan was sort of a buffer state, so it didn't really have that sort of culture of record keeping. So there was a long period where most of what we knew about Afghanistan was written by certain fields, and history really hadn't quite sort of caught up with it. And I think it was one of those things where in the last sort of 2 decades, historians have really sort of gone after Afghanistan again and tried to sort of push toward this sort of new sort of decolonized lens to Afghanistan that's sort of outside of the purview of the British Empire. So having said that, I as a historian was sort of faced with the fact that I'm studying a topic which, as it gets more contemporary, gets more um, difficult to study because the illegality of the product made it more clandestine. And so, as I started to get into records in the 60s and 70s, I'm referring more to police records and other materials that are state driven. But having said that, I think sort of what it meant was I basically started my research at the basic level. I looked at DEA records and Bureau of Narcotics of Dangerous Drugs, which was the sort of early anti sort of drug organizations in the U.S. A lot of UN records, as well as sort of late British colonial records, to get an understanding of what was going on. And then once I had that archival basis, I was able to sort of expand and branch off into different materials. So I went to spend a good deal of time at the Library of Congress, where they had a really wonderful trove of Afghan documents and diary. So I was able to get my hands on some government documents and newspaper documents, which focused on the issues of drugs and smuggling um, and then in 2014, I spent the summer doing research in Afghanistan, and that was an opportunity for me to really drink a lot of tea and try to find archival materials. And it was a really fascinating experience for me. But I found some really sort of great stuff on sort of early sort of legal pamphlets about sort of mapping out the landscape of drugs and drug control in the country. Um, and so when it sort of all came together, sort of the challenge for me as a historian to, one, navigate a topic which is increasingly outside of the purview of the state. When we think about like illicit drugs, like it's clandestine, it's criminal organizations. They don't really keep archives. I wish they did, but they don't really keep archives. And then also at the same time using our archives from the state and that are focusing on those entities. And so for me, it was trying to balance, what is the state saying about what's happening, what might be the holes in the state's view, and what can I read from the other end. And so in that sense, I was filling a gap. There was nothing. I mean, that was sort of one of the hard parts for me as a graduate student. Was a lot of my friends and colleagues were responding to history, and they were sort of easily able to find materials that either built off of things that had already been done, or were able to sort of offer a different perspective. But I was really going from nothing. There was nothing. I mean, there was virtually no historical inquiry prior to 1979. And so in the one hand, it was daunting, it was terrifying. I had no idea what I was doing. I was a graduate student, which is just crazy and terrifying experience. But it was also really, it was really fun. I mean, it's really nerdy. But there were times in the archives where I sort of had aha moments, and I sort of felt like a detective, figuring out a case where it clicked. And that of course was, really exciting for me, and to sort of like piece together a narrative that really had not been talked about before.
Right. It's putting together thousands of little pieces and trying to make sense of them and creating a narrative, which you did so beautifully in this book. One of the things your book does is it seems to reflect a sort of this global history of opium and Afghanistan, and how the two are entwined.
Mhm.
This whole history seems entwined with together. Can you talk briefly about what you found, how opium went from sort of this local crop, it wasn't really being exported that much, to this global commodity, to Afghanistan being, this major producer?
Yeah.
This was quite a dramatic story. And just for our viewers, talk a little bit about that in a summary kind of way.
Yeah. So I mean, I think any sort of commodity, if you're doing a commodity history, is ultimately, really sort of global. And I think for drugs, especially, So it was one of those things where, even though I'm sort of doing a national history of Afghanistan, it's sort of the way in which Afghanistan is shaping sort of the global environment of drugs, but also the global environment of drugs is shaping Afghanistan. So for viewers, Afghanistan was a small scale producer of opium in the late sort of 19th century, and sort of existed on the periphery of the colonial system. The British Empire, of course, had essentially commodified opium and had a legal trade for almost a century. And Afghanistan sort of got the coattails of that in the last sort of few decades prior to really sort of the 1930s. And what sort of changes a series of steps that, Afghanistan starts to trade to the legal pharmaceutical market in the 1930s. This was really interesting, where you had essentially American and European pharmaceutical companies buying Afghan opium. And what's fascinating about that is Afghan opium is fantastic. It's like exceptional quality. And what I mean by that is the morphine content, which is really what you're extracting when you're extracting opium, is you're extracting the morphine and the codeine and the thebaine and propofurine, which are the alkaloids that exist inside the gum. Is that the higher percentage of morphine, the better the quality. So if you get a kilo of opium and there's 20% morphine in it, you're getting more out of that than you would if there was 2 or 3% in that. And so, pharmaceutical companies became, quite aware of this was fantastic stuff. Like, this is really good stuff. The problem with this is that Afghans didn't really play by the book. They weren't, they one of my favorite little tidbits is they kind of throw a little extra opium at Bear Pharmaceuticals, and Bear Pharmaceuticals like, thank you, but like that's kind of like illegal and outside the boundaries of what's supposed to happen here. And what that did is it really kind of told regulatory, officials, particularly with sort of the budding international system, that Afghanistan was something to keep an eye on. And essentially what happens in 1945 is Afghanistan is convinced to prohibit opium, which is at this juncture kind of like a budding export trade. And they're convinced to prohibit opium in exchange for economic aid. And so for the next 2 decades, 3 decades, Afghanistan gets hundreds of millions of dollars from the US in particular to prohibit drugs. The problem with this is that it still remains a viable agricultural good to farmers on the ground. And so as the global market changed and the demand for opium grew and the demand for drugs grew, I talk about hash in the 1960s and the demand for hashish, expanded. Afghanistan was a really sort of ideal source. It was cheap, exceptional quality, some of the best hash in the world. And so for people that were trying to, make money, which most people are trying to do when you're in the drug trade, the illicit drug trade especially, it was really an ideal place to get drugs, and the government sort of recognized that. So this is sort of one of these things I talk about in the latter parts of the book, is that the Afghan government sort of in this conundrum. It's a poor country, and the government is really sort of weak in its ability to exert control on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also trying to placate the international donors that are kind of keeping it alive. And the United States is funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into this country, of which anti-drug measures are part of that deal. It's part of the diplomatic relationship. And sort of the flip side of this is that drugs are becoming, in the 1960s and 70s, really a viable agricultural good. And as the other sort of agricultural systems collapse, for wheat in particular, there's really very little other options other than opium and cannabis. And this is sort of the timing of this is really sort of ideal in many ways if you're in the drug trade, because in the 1970s, with the war on drugs, there are sort of these ruptures globally with supply from Turkey and Southeast Asia and Mexico. I mean, Richard Nixon literally closed the border with Mexico in 1969. So you had this sort of massive disruption of supply. And naturally, Afghan opium sort of started to sort of feed into this global market. And sort of one of the sort of things that I end with is that sort of the grand irony of this all is that, Afghanistan chose to make opium illegal and sort of embraced and increasingly embraced the war on drugs precisely at a time when opium was becoming arguably the most viable agricultural good in the country. And
I suppose a farmer could make a lot more per acre from growing opium than some kind of cabbage or something.
Totally. I mean, there's a point in 1973 and 74 where farmers are recognizing that you're going to make 5 to 10 times more producing opium than you would any other agricultural good. And there were big issues in 1972 and 73. They had a drought. They had a famine. 40,000 people die in 1972 of a famine. There's a bank collapse. So the national bank collapsed in 1972 and ran out of cash. So one of the things I talk about is like all of a sudden there's like cash flowing in these areas of the country that also seem to be growing lots of illicit drugs. Why is that? And it, it's just it's like we actually do this in my class. We sort of play out scenarios like this, and I think the reality is first, people that are living on the ground and growing crops, you're going to grow. I mean, this is a hard life, and you're going to grow what is the most viable crop for you. And so in that sense, if opium emerges as a crop that's going to give you 10 times more than you would for wheat, you're probably going to make that switch and start to grow to opium to really sort of stabilize your livelihood. And that's what happened.
And also that would affect the food supply, local food supply as well. There's so many ways that opium is a part of Afghanistan. And one of the things I had a question about this word quam. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And also the role and the tensions between religious authorities and state authorities, and how opium was part of that mix as well.
So kaum sort of, I believe it's an Arabic word in its origin. And the way it sort of functions in Afghanistan is sort of a fluid sense of identity. And what's really sort of important in Afghanistan is that the national identity that seems to dominate most of, we really could argue the 20th century, the most dominant form of an identity has been a national identity, regardless of how complicated that notion really is. It's sort of an imagined identity anyways. But in Afghanistan, the state never really was able to build a consensus around a national identity. And so what I mean by that is that on the ground in Afghanistan, to be an Afghan was largely to be associated with the government. Almost everyone else identified in other ways, particularly in sort of the ethno-linguistic way. So Pashtun, Tajik, Uzbeks, these are sort of the dominant sort of ethnic groups. And then you'd even get down and sort of minor and more nuanced forms of identity. And how that sort of plays out for me, and so just to make sure to sort of reassure this, is that dominates much of the local functioning of how people operate on a daily basis. They obviously they will mix and interact, but many of the key functioning of deals and relationships function along those lines of your kaum, of your ethnic identity. And so how this plays out into drugs is that when the government, particularly in the 1970s, where I see it as most acute, is trying to they're building these sort of national programs. They have these like anti-smuggling units, which are like national police units, and they're trying to crack down on the drug trade. Is that those police officers that are carrying out the drug trade, that are carrying out the policing of this counter narcotics, are balancing this new national identity. They're in the Afghan police, or they have this identity, but they also have their more important identity and the more fundamental identity as a Tajik or an Uzbek or Pashtun. And why that's important is that when things actually go into effect, that many of the police officers, particularly when we get into like the gendarme and which are sort of like the border police, is that many of them gravitate towards supporting their kaum, their sort of ethno-linguistic brethren, rather than sort of the national project. And so if you sort of think about it this way, if the national government's telling you to prohibit drugs and go and shoot people who are crossing the border with drugs, but that person might happen to be your cousin, you're going to turn a blind eye. And so what was sort of big about this is that this was happening on a fairly large scale. I mean, there's a point where one of the DEA officers sort of comments that it was almost impossible to sort of transcend that identity, and that basically teaching these smuggling units was in essence like grooming one of the most sophisticated criminal cartels in the country. It's sort of like one of these things where like a lot of these police, they're not buying into that national project and that identity, and that it's more important for them to preserve their group. And so if if I'm a Tajik and we're and the group that we're about to bust is run by Tajiks, they're unlikely to really sort of kick the door down and arrest these people. Versus, if it's a Pashtun, which is a rival group, yeah, we'll kick the door down and arrest these people because it serves my interest and my group's interest. And so it was just impossible for authorities to sort of put a really sort of a counter narcotics program in effect in a way that was wide ranging and ultimately effective. And it was just totally ineffective.
It sounds like the 19th century idea of nationalism, as Westerners understand it, was a layer on top of tribal cultures or tribal groups that never really adapted to that Western idea or accepted it fully. And this seems like Afghanistan then is a whole series of smaller entities that are somehow confederated together rather than really a united national entity in some ways, and that probably is affecting so many other aspects of it. One of the things you mentioned earlier was that the pharmaceutical companies and they wanted medical uses of opium, which of course were legitimate and legal avenues for selling the poppies and the opium. And the difference between that and the recreational intoxicant use of opium, you mentioned in your book how the British through India had sold opium to China. And then, as you mentioned, the tail end, Afghanistan sort of tagging on to that as the British started prohibiting development of opium in India. More of the trade was picked up by Afghanistan. And I'm wondering, can you explain to your audience briefly a little bit like, how does this whole relationship or situation because of India and what was going on in colonial India affect the development of the state as a non-colonialized nation, yet affected so dramatically Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think it's really important because there was a recognition, I think, from some of the really early sort of founders of the modern Afghan state, Abdul Rahman Khan, Amanullah Khan. These are, when you sort of look at the history of Afghanistan in sort of its most modern iteration, these are sort of the figures at the top that sort of are iconic in the sense that they, Abdul Rahman Khan mapped out the boundaries of Afghanistan that we know today. And Amanullah Khan really sort of put in many really sort of built a modern state in the legal sense. Like he put in the Constitution, this goes in effect in 23, and there's various amendments to this in 24 and 25. Really tried to bring Afghanistan into the modern age. And this was, this is happening all over the Islamic world with Turkey and Iran. And so how this sort of fits into drugs is, the British had recognized opium, and there's arguments about this among historians about how big the opium trade was. Some people say it was really sort of fundamental, like, and this guy Carl Trocky basically calls it the keystone. If you sort of think about like an arch and the keystone, if you take the keystone out, the arch collapses, and he calls opium the keystone commodity. And I actually think it's a pretty good and sort of analogy in the sense that opium really helped the British gain access to China. Obviously, they did this like physically with the Opium Wars in 39 to 42, but it allowed them to buy goods that they couldn't otherwise sell. The Chinese just aren't buying British goods. They don't want their stuff, except they want their opium. And so this allows the British to get the tea and the porcelain and the silk and the things that are becoming, interesting enough. You would talk about this all the time in my classes. Like when you think about British culture, what do you think? You think of tea. Well, have you ever been to a tea plantation in Britain? No, because it's cold. It's terrible. Like doesn't exist. It's a product of colonialism. Sugar, all of these things. And so opium became really sort of a fundamental product to sort of facilitate this process of buying these goods. And so what's really interesting by the time we get to the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, is that the British, there's really sort of growing resentment against the opium trade, sort of bigger calls for the prohibition of opium. People are more cognizant of sort of the issues with opium use, and that's addictive and dangerous. And but the problem with this for the British is that they're dependent on the excise tax. It's a wonderful agricultural good. People that love it. This is like capitalism in a nutshell. You don't make a product for people to use non-habitually. If you can make a habitual product, that's ideal for capitalism. And so the British are struggle with this for a couple of decades about, well, we can't really abandon this good because it's really important to the taxes and then the state. So the problem that then emerges is that as opium becomes increasingly taxed by the British, the Afghans realize that it's overtaxed. So one of the things that Abdul Rahman Khan and Amanullah Khan do is that they allow export of opium out of their country. They don't tax it or tax it very little, with the hope that they can sell more of the product in British India. And the hope is to sort of garner some of the demand for that product that's decreasing because of the overtaxation of colonial opium. And so what I found really interesting about this was that British authorities start to really sort of pick up on this pretty quickly, that wait a minute, all of a sudden there's this stuff coming from Afghanistan that's much cheaper, and people are buying it. And not only are they buying it, but we're finding out that the state is advocating for these groups to go down. And basically the theory of this was that any capital coming back into Afghanistan is good. Any amount of resources and capital that's flowing back into the country is good, regardless if it's taxed directly or not. And so this sort of unleashes this period in the late 20s where the British are sort of contemplating what to do. And one of the projects that I'm actually working on right now, which is one of my more sort of academic projects, is that what contributes to the prohibition of opium in British India is the inability to control it. And that is influenced in large part by the increase in smuggled opium and hashish from Afghanistan, that the British authorities can't compete with it. It's superior quality and it's cheap. And so in a lot of the bazaars, what is now Pakistan, but what at the time was essentially sort of, Northwest India, British India, they can't control it. And this, of course, they're losing money. And that is what speaks volumes. So it's not so much like the human issue of people being addicted to drugs. It's more like, well, we have created this really important agricultural product of which we tax, but we're now being undermined by a smuggled good from the country north, and we can't compete with it. And part of that then contributes to the British prohibiting opium, but more importantly, sort of notifies Afghans that, hey, like, we have something here as an export good. And this then flows into the 1930s when you get the transition to sort of pharmaceutical companies, and just like during this period, this is where, even though they prohibit opium, the legal trade is the part of that deal. Is, all right, we're going to get rid of sort of this excise system and these agricultural systems, but if you're a pharmaceutical company that's manufacturing narcotics, you're manufacturing morphine and turning it into sort of pharmaceutical drugs, that's legal. Right. And so this then allows a shift for big businesses to sort of take up the production and sale of these drugs. And Afghanistan sort of, shifts from selling and smuggling opium into British India to then sort of catering to these new sort of pharmaceutical companies that are demanding these drugs.
Right, and that brings in the American kind of power, the money of the purchasing power from the Americans. And one of the things that you brought into your book that I found very interesting was this view that American views of drug use and, sort of the prohibition and prohibiting it, that had such a huge global impact on the cultivation of opium in Afghanistan. And, it had, I guess, unintended consequences, maybe you could call it. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's sort of like one of the underlying narratives that exists in my book is like, why are drugs illegal in Afghanistan? And like, especially there's 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 just sort of like more and more events that occur that sort of give you this sense that like maybe they should have legalized drugs. Like maybe they should be one of the legal producers of opium. Like it doesn't make much sense that they're not. And I see this really sort of stemming from the diplomatic relationship, and this sort of the crux of my book is that as World War II was ending, there was a period during the war where kind of all those international regulations were set aside, and the ambitions to suppress the illicit drug trade was set aside because of the war. And so everyone wants drugs for the war. Morphine is a fundamental product in
Yeah.
wartime.
Yeah, you need a lot of it.
You need a lot of it. And so they're buying it up. And so this is where Afghanistan starts to be like, hey, we got great stuff. We'll sell it to you. And the United States is like, fine, we'll do it. But towards like 1944, the United States is like, hey, we kind of think we're going to win this war. Um, the anti-drug people can start making that shift now to emphasizing a new regulatory model. And I think why this is really sort of significant is that this debate, and it happens like continually throughout the book, is like, well, wait a minute, maybe Afghan opium should be legal. Like maybe, like, I mean, during this period, the only other significant export crop was karakul, which is literally lambskin, which is like, oh, okay, what a wonderful export good, right? Like what, so you have opium or lambskin. One of them seems to be a much more viable agricultural export good.
Need a lot of
So
lessons.
yeah, right. I know. So, and you could sort of see just sort of the sort of rationale that, this sort of come in where this like, this makes sense. Like they should probably be a legal producer. It's a poor country. This would help them build a sort of modern state. But this is really where sort of the counter, or the anti-drugs, sort of counter narcotics sort of people win, which is like, hey, this is not just about pragmatism. This is about morality, and this is about drugs are bad, and this is about reimposing not just political power, but sort of cultural power in this part of the world. And this is where that appeal is like, hey, if you show us that you can prohibit drugs and prohibit opium, we will do things for you that will help you in other ways. And this is where, I mean, this is, what I find fascinating is that this is really where the US and the Afghans, the diplomatic relationship really solidifies, is over the issue of opium, is prohibit opium and we will give you aid, and we will sign a deal, and we will help develop your economy by virtue of making a political and cultural statement that drugs are bad, and prohibiting drugs. And so in 1945, the government announces, we're going to prohibit drugs. We're going to stop the government production of opium. And so the shirkats, which are essentially government producers, or sort of licensed producers of opium, shut down with the air quotes because they didn't quite shut down. But it was all done to get the United States to invest in their country. And of course, the United States will invest, and they'll focus on the Helmand Valley, which will become sort of the epicenter of American sort of agro-industrial development in the country, in Afghanistan. But that was all sort of contingent upon acquiescing to the international norms regarding opium and
So you have the situation, which has irony in so many directions. It's unbelievable. Of the U.S. which is probably a huge purchaser of drugs at this time, and the morphine and everything else for the war, and the pharmaceutical companies on the one level. On the other level, having this moralistic viewpoint that's imposing prohibition at the source, so to speak, in Afghanistan, in turn is strengthening their national governments, but yet still the local people are not buying into this because they're not benefiting by all of this theoretically, or not as much, I guess. And so everything seems to be kind of a failure.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
the prohibition of the source. I mean, why was prohibition at the source in terms of the whole global effort that was made against drugs, prohibiting drugs, making drugs illegal, lots of police action, all these things. But prohibition at the source seems to have been a failed policy. Why was that? Why,
Yeah.
it seems, if you can't get any product, then people can't use as much, but it seems just it raises the price and makes it harder to get and makes it go underground rather than getting rid of it at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of this goes to the point that much of how Americans and Western Europeans viewed drug use was in highly racialized terms. And so, I mean, this is where if early, 20th century, if you were addicted to opium, say you were smoking opium, they would call you yellow, which was essentially meaning you were turning Chinese, the assumption that all Chinese smoked opium and were addicted to opium.
Yeah.
And so there was always that element of which drugs were seen as a consequence of sort of the foreign invasion of things coming from the outside. And this is where you get into the sort of Orientalist views where, it was always projected to be strongly associated with Asia and the Orient, China and Iran or Persia and the subcontinent. And that the assumption, of course, was that it was ingrained in those cultures, which of course is not entirely true, right? Like in China, opium was a luxury good until the 1800s, when it was just the country was flooded with drugs from the British. But the point is that part of the solution then was recognizing and saying, hey, the problem is not so much us, its problem is that we're being subjected to this influence and this invasion from the outside, and we need to stop it at the source. And so they were sort of compelled in this regard to sort of focus on sort of what we call sort of supply side issues, which is that, focusing on where the source is. The obvious problem with this is that if you don't deal with demand and you don't make an effort to reduce demand, all you're doing is going to shift who is supplying the drugs. People are always going to try to find a way to fill the demand, and if the demand is there, someone's going to fill it. And so, yeah, so I mean, I think basically what you have over the course of much of the 20th century is kind of a cat and mouse game where authorities are trying to focus on supplies from certain areas, and supply just shifts, and people, you have a lot of these sort of regional markets that are filling various regional demand that then fill global demand, and states at certain points will sort of crack down and impose their will and sort of get these to stop, but the demand is always there. And I think one of the great fallacies that exists, and it still sort of permeates today, is that drugs is a recent phenomenon, and is almost sort of non-human in its relationship. And I think it's entirely ahistorical. Humans have been using drugs like literally since we were humans. I mean, this is
thousands of years is recorded.
Yeah, I mean, it's once people became sedentary and ate a plant and they were like, wow, this plant makes me feel fantastic, they kept doing it. And I mean, the knowledge of these plants, whether it's opium, cannabis, I mean, you get into psychedelic drugs, and we're going back thousands of years. And I think what that ambition was to create a world without drugs. And that's just, in many cases, an impossible task. And I think that still resonates today. I mean, you still have organizations like Drug Free America and all these organizations, and they're taking what is arguably a noble cause, helping people, trying to get people not to use drugs, but it's impossible. I mean, people have been using drugs forever, and it's one of those things where that ambition to stop drugs completely is woefully incomplete and impossible, rather than maybe a more sort of rational approach being, what are the better ways to sort of reduce the most harmful effects of drug use, and recognizing that humans are imperfect and struggle with life and are going to use drugs, and what are ways that we can prevent them from becoming addicted, and other more rational approaches. but it was, you know, built into the ethos of counter narcotics. It was a crusade, a moral crusade to wipe the world of drugs. Of course, you know, what one of the, again, to go back to the ironies, is that a lot of the great drug crusaders were drug addicts. I mean, you know, like it's that sort of balancing of the public and the private, is that in public people take on these sort of, you know, very loud, you know, moral, you know, declarations, of which, you know, counter narcotics or anti-drugs is, you know, most, you know, one of the more prominent declarations, but in private are just as human as everyone else, and are, you know, using drugs to cope with the pains and struggles of life. So yeah, I think it just, you know, it's been part of the ethos of counter narcotics for the better part of a century, and regardless of the failure, it resonates. I think that's starting to change, though. I mean, I think people are starting to realize, like, hey, this just isn't working. But that's a more sort of recent thing.
Well, what would be some of the lessons the U.S. could learn from this history that you've written, to help better formulate foreign policy?
Hmm.
You know, what would be some of your recommendations or things that you see might be in the near future that we could benefit from, the understanding of how these things, the ups and downs, the unintended consequences,
Mhm.
the failed histories, and so on?
I think one of the most important ones for me is, that peasants and farmers and people on the ground they're not stupid, they're not criminals, they're not, you know, there's a tendency among sort of, you know, particularly, you know, anti-drug workers, that they're, you know, that they're bad people because they're producing drugs. That's just not the way it works on the ground. It's not how people see it on the ground. And I think there needs to be a recognition about sort of the local context and the reality of people's livelihood on the ground, and America could do well to listen to what those people are saying and what they're doing. And what that means is, if opium is a viable product, it's recognizing it as a viable product and working within the confines of this. I mean, this is something that there's a group in France called the Sunless Council. I can't remember what they changed their name to something, but they argued as a way to transition Afghanistan into a global economy was to make them the eighth legal producer of opium. And it seems quite rational. Obviously, it would be imperfect. I think there would still be illicit drugs. Um, but it would provide a pathway for farmers to enter legal markets, and also allow the government to tax, build infrastructure, and sort of support, really sort of the legitimation of state power in a positive way, in a way that sort of responds to the demands of the people. I think the other thing sort of goes directly to the war on drugs, which is, that the more sort of coercive elements of the war on drugs, particularly crop eradications, have done more harm than good. When you eradicate poor farmers or farmers' livelihoods, it not only has the effect of displacing crops and forcing farmers to adapt, which they do, they always do, but it also undermines the state. And well, this is, you know, one of the main premises of my book, is that as Afghanistan embraces anti-drug measures, it alienates Afghans, because Afghans are dependent on this product to survive. And so if the ultimate goal of the United States is to build democratic institutions and to build functional, equitable, efficient states, embracing policies that are counterintuitive to that, um, you shouldn't do it. You should do it. And so I think that sort of goes back, and the need to sort of step back and sort of reevaluate, the mission. And I think, having, you know, sort of been around that environment of policymakers, is it often it gets reduced to those sort of simplistic, sort of bifurcated identities of like good guy, bad guy, criminals, and states. And it's just way more complicated than that. And you know, even when we think about like the Taliban, which just took over in August 2021, people are like, well, they're terrorists. Well, I'm like, well, then how did they take over a country? And yeah, people left, but like they literally took over a country in a matter of 3 or 4 days. That there's a reason for that, and a lot of that is because the state was corrupt, the state was inefficient,
Right.
And counter narcotics don't help in that regard because there's such a dependency on these products. So I think it's about really sort of implementing and embracing policies that allow for pathways outside of these sort of narrow moral confines of like drugs are bad, these are criminals, these are terrorists, and to sit there and sort of think about, well, what's the broader sort of political goal that we're trying to achieve here? Take for example what I talked about in the last chapter on the Hellman. They're basically teaching farmers in the Hellman to grow crops for the global market, to be like good capitalist farmers, except for opium. It's like, well, capitalism doesn't work that way. Like, capitalism doesn't care if they're growing opium or growing wheat. It's whatever makes you the most money. And so they're built there. It's like it's almost this like naivete to assume that farmers are going to grow all the legal crops, but not that one. Like, that's bad. That's what the bad guys do. It's like, yeah, except the bad guy one makes 10 times more money than the legal stuff. And if you're a farmer and you have like significant pressures on an annual basis, you're going to grow what's going to make your life stable. And we would all do the same if we were in that position. And so I just think it's one of those things to sort of step back from the sort of high moral perch and to sort of have a more pragmatic approach about what's working, and to really sort of think about, if the United States is really about promoting democracy and promoting sort of equitable and efficient governance, then there's better ways to do that than sort of, I would say, particularly the more coercive forms of prohibition, such as like crop eradications and things that tend to alienate Afghans and tend to alienate people rather than bring them into the fold.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. James, I wanted to ask you, what kind of new projects are you working on these days? And are you still working in an area that has to do with drugs and drug history?
Yeah, I got multiple projects. I'm still sort of working on Afghan stuff. Obviously, I'm not going to Afghanistan anytime soon. It's not really very conducive for research.
Not yet.
Um, so I'm sort of have a couple sort of articles that I'm working on. One is on sort of early colonial or late British colonial, early sort of Afghan state stuff, which I was sort of mentioning earlier about sort of how Afghan smuggling sort of contributed to the British prohibiting opium. Another project that I'm working on is um, based off of CIA documents, really about the collapse of the Afghan state in 1978-79, which is really not the collapse of the state, it's really the beginning of the Afghan-Soviet War. And there's some really interesting work about sort of the responses among drug markets. How did they respond to the outbreak of war? And so I'm sort of looking and exploring about how did people that were growing opium on the ground, how did they respond to these shocks of a massive outbreak of conflict? And what ways did opium kind of help them? Because one of the things that I'm sort of finding is that for many farmers, some of whom are participating directly in the conflict, opium is emerging as a really sort of great way to raise revenue, to buy resources, to fight the war. And then I have sort of two less academic ones. One of the ones that's sort of jumping into in a little bit is called Artists on Drugs, and it's a podcast that sort of just getting rolling here, which is I'm interviewing musicians and artists, actors, about their relationship with drugs, the politics of drugs, how drugs have influenced their music, how, were they addicted, what happened, why, what about sobriety, how has sobriety shaped their music. So it's really just sort of a way for me to have a frank discussion with artists. So I'm setting that up. And then one of the other projects is I'm working with a colleague at Berklee, Alicia Bowers, and we're working on an opioid project about essentially the history of opioid addiction in Boston. And so this summer we'll be interviewing, we're kind of doing a full spectrum interview. So we're going to interview drug users, recovering addicts, people that, doctors, police. We're interviewing community organizations, anyone that's been affected by the opioid epidemic, which, I think for our faculty and students, obviously it's in our face at Berklee. I think you see the consequences of it just on the streets of Boston. And we're trying to sort of humanize a little bit and to sort of build, I think, a better bridge to the community, the Fenway community, a little bit, with a project that sort of gives voice to people, and hopefully a forum for us to sort of come to a better understanding of what's the better ways as a community and better ways as an institution with Berklee to help people in need. So those are all the things that I got going on right now. Yeah.
That's a lot, and I wish you really good luck with that. It's such a needed area to be explored and examined, so that people can find ways of reaching out and helping those in need. There's such a great problem, not only in Boston proper, but all over the state and the country as well.
Right. It's huge. I mean, in the last 2 years, 100,000 people each year have died of drug overdose during the pandemic.
That's a tremendous number of people, and it really is such a tragedy.
Yeah, and ultimately I think it comes down to it's kind of a symptom of a loss of community, and I think that's kind of one of the things that we're trying to do with this, is to build a little bit of a better sense of community, so that people who feel marginalized and feel disenfranchised know that there's resources within those communities to help them and get their life back together. Because I think that's just sort of, when you look at what's happened in the US across the board, it's just, and many of these places have been affected most deeply by the opioid epidemic. There's really been a loss of community, and that sort of rugged individualism has this is sort of one of the sad ironies of that is that without that community, a lot of people feel hopeless and lost, and that's just really sort of exacerbated this problem. Yeah. So we're hoping to address that with this project. So
I hope, and so hopefully with the waning of the pandemic, possibly more of that can be done. Well, thank you so much for coming to Books at Berklee and talking about your book. I think a lot of people who will read it will get a lot out of it. And it's not a history that's maybe as widely known as some other histories, certainly by people here, maybe elsewhere, people are more familiar with it, but it's certainly pertinent to so many of the lives of the people that we interact with every single day. And we don't even sometimes realize how this history has had an impact on our lives and the politics and the days that we live in and the communities and society as it's developed here, as well as elsewhere around the world. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judy. This was excellent. This is fun.
Thank you so much.